Hi, and welcome to another episode of PTSD Nation. One of the aims of PTSD Nation, of this podcast series, is to focus on education, including highlighting a range of cutting-edge treatment options. To this end, today's guest is Professor Bernard Lerer, who's the director of Hadassah Brain Labs, which is at the Center for Psychedelic Research at the Hadassah Medical Center at the Hebrew University here in Jerusalem, Israel. With hundreds of peer-reviewed publications and numerous awards, Professor Lerer is a global leader in the field of psychiatry and neuroscience. We'll discuss the professor's insights on the use of psychedelic therapy as a treatment options. Welcome, Professor Lerer, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.
We'll start off by asking you, what inspired your focus on psychedelic research as a tool for healing in the context of mental health?
I've been a psychiatrist and a psychopharmacologist for many years. And my primary research focus over all these years has been to find better and more effective and safer treatments for psychiatric disorders. That's what's inspired my research. And it became clear to me in recent years that psychedelics offered an amazing promise in this area, that there was really the possibility of developing treatments based on traditional psychedelics that could actually change the entire perspective on mental illness.
Interesting. Is there a difference between traditional and non-traditional psychedelics?
Well, in the field of research on psychedelics, traditional psychedelics are the ones that are either being produced from plants or animals like psilocybin or 5-MeO-DMT from the toad. And non-traditional psychedelics are those that are synthesized, either synthesized chemically or synthesized as derivatives of plant or animal-based psychedelics.
Interesting. We'll get into a bit more detail in those later. During your service in the First Lebanon War and your subsequent work at Tel HaShomer Hospital, you were involved in addressing PTSD consequences faced by soldiers. Can you share some insights from that time, the pivotal chapter in your life, specifically regarding the PTSD treatments that were available at the time? And also, how has your understanding of PTSD and its treatments evolved over the years since that time, given the advancements that we've seen in psychiatry over the years?
Well, it was a long time ago, but one doesn't forget wars. The First Lebanon War, I served as a psychiatrist in the Israel Defense Force and as the head of a psychiatric unit that was attached to a tank division that fought some very, very pitched battles in the First Lebanon War, primarily against the Syrian army. And we treated a lot of people with combat reactions, with acute combat reactions. Of course, they were not yet PTSD. They were acute reactions to things that people experienced in combat. And I had not served in combat before that, but I had learned in the context of my service training how to deal with combat reactions. And that's what we did. And I can tell you a bit more about how we did it, if you like. But then after the war, I served for many years as in my reserve duty in the clinic at Tel HaShomer Hospital, now called Sheba Hospital, which actually dealt with veterans who had undergone combat reactions and then developed PTSD. So for many years, I worked with PTSD in this context.
And so have you seen much of how it's evolved in more recent years, the reaction, the response by the military and perhaps beyond?
Yes, well, I had the opportunity to talk to people who served in Gaza and treated soldiers who developed combat reactions in Gaza. The underlying principles have actually not changed, and that is to support, psychological support, non-use of medications acutely, and creating the expectation in the soldier that he would return to serve with his unit, and not that the war was over for him. They found, for example, in the Yom Kippur War, that being evacuated was a very strong factor leading to PTSD, as opposed to remaining in the unit and dealing with the problem, while, of course, receiving psychological support.
That's very interesting because some of our previous guests, we've discussed this precise issue, and what they were sharing with us is the more recent responses by the IDF, exactly in addressing what you've just pointed out, which is maintaining the soldiers in the area of combat, keeping them together as a group so that they don't necessarily go back to their homes and general environments, and then develop all sorts of things that are less controlled. So it was a very interesting observation in terms of how we've seen the way the military responds to
That's
this issue.
exactly what we did in Lebanon more than 40 years ago. Exactly that. Creating the expectancy of being able to recover and being able to function, providing support, providing help, providing warmth, providing food and sustenance. And that same approach exists to this day, as you pointed out.
What are the main expected benefits of the use of psychedelic treatment, especially in the context of PTSD? And of course, I say expected because it's still not something that's being used here in Israel. So the question is if we know what to expect if and when it will become in use.
Well, the hope and the expectation is that psychedelics can make a huge difference. PTSD, especially when it's chronic, is very, very difficult to treat. There are not a lot of effective treatments for PTSD. Psychological treatment is probably more effective than treatment with medications, even though the two compounds that are licensed or approved to treat PTSD are both SSRI antidepressants. So the potential of having a treatment which can make a difference, as is strongly suggested by the recent studies on the use of MDMA in patients with PTSD, accompanied by psychotherapy, that expectation is very exciting indeed.
And I did notice, as someone who comes from Victoria in Australia, that there they changed the law as of last July, where in certain cases, psychiatrists are now entitled to, or certain psychiatrists are entitled to prescribe MDMA specifically for this treatment. So that's really a fascinating development. I think probably more cutting edge and very rare to be used in this way across the world, I imagine. Is that correct?
Yes, but I think that people should be very clearly aware that the amazing results achieved in the MAPS studies of PTSD with MDMA were achieved with MDMA that is given in order to bolster the effects of psychotherapy. I mean, I'm a psychopharmacologist, but I was trained in psychotherapy many years ago. And there's no question that what worked in the MDMA studies was the combination of psychotherapy with PTSD. Even in the control group, which received psychotherapy only, there was quite a strong response, better than most people see with SSRI antidepressants today. So I think we're not talking about a chemical effect alone. We're talking about a combination of psychotherapy and the chemical effect.
You used the word before, and I'm interested in the definition of psilocybin and the difference between chemical and non-chemical version of that.
Well, first of all, psilocybin, of course, and MDMA are very different. MDMA is what is called an entactogen. It's a compound that is not mind-altering in the sense that psilocybin is. And it more affects the way people relate to themselves and relate to others and relate to their inner selves. Psilocybin is, of course, a psychedelic in every sense of the word. Psilocybin is derived from psilocybin mushrooms, and most of the trials conducted today with psilocybin have used the chemical version of psilocybin, which is synthesized in. There are studies that use psilocybin derived from the mushroom along with the mushroom extract with varying purity of the psilocybin. And it could very well be that there's a difference in the effects. We found that in a recent paper in looking at metabolomic effects and looking at effects on synaptic plasticity. We found that there were stronger effects of the extract containing psilocybin than of the chemical psilocybin. And there are a lot of anecdotal reports, a lot of people who use mushrooms and also use psilocybin chemically have used them, find the psilocybin, which is derived from natural sources, to be different, to be much more comfortable to use. But the actual empirical research on the stopping is very much in its infancy.
Which leads to another question of where does Israel actually currently stand on the use of psychedelics as a form of treatment? And how does this compare to other countries?
There are a lot of studies going on in Israel or being planned in Israel, most of them with psilocybin, but not only. There are MDMA studies being planned in PTSD. There are compassionate trials being approved for the use of MDMA in PTSD. The research area in Israel is very, very active. And Israel differs from Australia in that there is no situation whereby, according to law, a clinician can prescribe any psychedelic compound today. So in that regard, it's different. But I think that we're going along the correct route, and I think we're doing it better than we did with cannabis. I think with cannabis, there was a dearth of proper research. There was a dearth of preclinical research as well as clinical research. And I think it affected the way in which the whole industry developed. There's a much stronger focus on empirical research, both clinical and preclinical with psychedelics. And I think that's going to be good for the field.
Do you expect that in coming years, it will be something that will be used regularly here in Israel?
I believe that psychedelics and also psychedelic-derived compounds will make a huge difference to psychiatry. That is my expectation and hope. And obviously, that'll be the case in Israel as well as elsewhere in the world. There are a lot of problems en route. And probably the biggest one of all is in clinical trials, proving that compounds actually do work and are not working because of their so-called placebo effects. You know, when a person takes a psychedelic, the effect is dramatic. And when a person in the control group gets a pill which doesn't have much effect on him, he's pretty disappointed. And so one has to be sure that the effects are real effects, but there are strategies to overcome that. And eventually, I'm pretty optimistic about the contribution of psychedelics to mental health.
Great. I think obviously it will be very helpful to many people who suffer from PTSD and other mental health issues. Touching on something that we briefly arose earlier, the reality is many people around the world use psychedelics for recreational purposes. Of course, this is currently illegal here in Israel and elsewhere, and may also be dangerous. Nevertheless, is there a safe way to use psychedelics, or would there be any benefit to its use, especially in what's now being referred to as microdose form?
I don't have an opinion on the recreational use of psychedelics. I don't have an opinion on the recreational use of cannabis. My interest in psychedelics is in the context of medicine and therapy, and it's used to help people in a medical or psychotherapeutic context. As far as microdosing is concerned, it's very interesting. And of course, here's many reports about microdosing. However, the empirical evidence that microdosing actually achieves something lags behind the hype. I'm not saying that it doesn't do anything. And there are studies both in mice and preclinical studies and studies in humans, where some of them are positive, some of them are less positive. So I think the question is still open as to whether microdosing works as a therapeutic strategy. If it worked, it would be great, because one of the biggest problems in translating psychedelic therapy to the real world is the enormous expense. It costs a great deal of money to do psychedelic treatment, and someone is going to have to pay that. And if we can reduce the cost, then the likelihood that more people would be able to get psychedelic therapy is increased.
Where are the main costs attached, out of interest?
Well, when you think about it, you need a team of people to administer psychedelics. When a person goes to a doctor and gets a pill, he takes the prescription, goes to the pharmacy, and that's it. To get a psychedelic even once, that person needs preparatory sessions. That person needs to have, say, with psilocybin, a session of 8 to 12 hours where there are two people that accompany him, even if they are not therapists. The two people have to be with that person in the room. And then there's integration sessions that follow. So you're talking about a package that is not cheap. If it works, then it's worth more, worth everything. If it works, it can help people. But in the end, someone has to pay for it. And that reality is going to be difficult to navigate.
Interesting. Given the current Israel-Hamas war and other local tensions as often exist in this part of the world, obviously this is a particularly stressful time for many here in Israel and across the world. How do you personally manage stress during such challenging times?
This is an extremely stressful time. I've lived in Israel for almost 50 years, and it is the most stressful period I've ever experienced. There is the ongoing tragedy of the hostages being held in Gaza. That is painful, that is worrying, it wakes one up at night. And these are ordinary people whose lives have been disrupted and have been taken into captivity without any justifiable reason, and are being held there in conditions that one does not wish to even imagine. There is a stress. There is a continuing and ongoing stress. I responded immediately by increasing my clinical commitment. I do very little clinical work, but immediately the war began, and I increased my clinical commitment in order to free up people who need to go and do other things, which, because of my age, I'm not able to do. I think that, and this is something I try and press upon my team, and did so in particular right at the beginning, and that is there's huge value to maintaining your routine. There's huge value to continuing to do the constructive things you've always done. And if you've always exercised, as I do, to continue to exercise on a regular basis, to create, to do something which is meaningful, and not to watch the news the whole day long, which of course is terribly, terribly depressing.
That's essentially you're saying remain grounded, staying routine, don't get too distracted by what's going on out there in either in Gaza or whatever the challenge is, and remain focused, I guess. Finally, could you share any insights, tools, or mechanisms that our listeners might find useful in managing PTSD, coping with traumatic experiences, or perhaps even supporting someone who is suffering from either PTSD or some other trauma?
Most of the people that I see clinically have PTSD, and some of them had PTSD for decades. The oldest person with PTSD that I treated was someone who had developed PTSD during the Israel War of Independence. He was in his late 80s when I saw him in the clinic, and he still had significant PTSD symptoms. This is a very, very difficult condition to treat, and it's a very difficult condition for people to deal with. I saw in a lot of my patients that when the war erupted, there was a severe worsening in their condition. But I think that, first of all, psychological support helps. Once or twice, I've asked my patients, I'm not giving you any medicine that makes you better. How does it help to come and see me? And they say to me, it helps. It helps because you listen. It helps because there's somebody who understands the situation I'm in. On a more practical level, there are treatments for people with early PTSD in particular. There are psychological treatments involving desensitization, involving debriefing. There are many psychological strategies that work. And I think these strategies should be implemented. I think that as far as there is a suggestion that transcranial magnetic stimulation may work, but I think that there is a real hope that psychedelics are going to make a difference. Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Psychedelics may work even without a trip in disorders like obsessive compulsive disorder, but I doubt that they're going to work in PTSD.
So essentially, it's also it's not a one size fits all in addressing PTSD on the one hand. And then besides from that, it's critical that we as PTSD sufferers decide and inquire what best suits us and then follow up with that treatment, whether it is psychological support, whether it is medication, being active, and those types of things. Would that be accurate?
I think that psychological treatment support is one side of it, but there are actual activistic psychological treatments which make a difference. And I think that they can be extremely helpful. I think that the continued treatment is important. Existing medications are of some help. But I think that one's eye is on the future and the hope that psychedelic treatments could make a substantive difference.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Professor Lerer, for your time and invaluable insights. I'm sure our listeners now have a much greater understanding of some of the potential treatment options to address PTSD and other mental health challenges. To our listeners, thank you again for joining us and stay tuned for the next episode of PTSD Nation. Until then, shalom from Israel. Professor Lerer, could you provide us with an overview of the upcoming Psychedelic Medicine Israel conference in later this year, 2024, and share what participants can expect in terms of themes, research, and training opportunities? How do you envision this conference impacting the integration of psychedelics into mainstream medicine?
Well, you put it very well, because that exactly is the aim of the conference, the integration of psychedelics into mainstream medicine. This is an international conference. It is supported and sponsored by the Hebrew University, Hadassah, the major professional organizations of psychiatrists in Israel, with support from people working on pain and palliative medicine, and also with strong support from MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which has had such an enormous impact on modern research in this area. Our intention is exactly what you said, to focus on how can psychedelics be integrated in clinical medicine. We will have preclinical research. We will have clinical research as well. We will have research related to social and ethical issues, which will play a prominent role. And since the October 7 massacre and the war which followed, we're going to have a special track in the conference, which will focus on psychedelics, trauma, and war. And we're calling for abstracts now. The entire conference program was closed, but we opened it again in order to enable people who have anything relevant to this major theme of the conference, which we've introduced, to present their data. And even though previously abstract submission was closed, we've reopened it. We're focusing strongly on young researchers from all over the world. We're giving support stipends to young researchers in order to help them, young or people new to the field, even if they're not so young. And in order to help them attend, we're giving stipends to Israeli researchers and students to help them attend. And, the conference faces serious headwinds. These are difficult times. And we are determined that we are going ahead, whatever happens. The conference is not going to be cancelled. under any circumstances. And we're immensely grateful to the people overseas, especially who registered. Approximately 50 to 60% of people who registered have indicated that even in spite of the situation, they're planning to come. And that's actually amazing.
That does sound amazing, and kudos for you for undertaking this conference, and hopefully it will be a great success and meet your expectation.